Hey guys, hope everybody's doing well. I know this is a trying time, but just think of it like this: we're getting down near the end, and we will get back to normal at some point in time. I hope everybody's doing well. Hope everybody's safe and sound. And again, guys, don't hesitate to reach out to me. Okay, if you need me, email me. Most of you have my cell phone number. You can text me. So like I said, the silver lining is we're almost done, right? We're getting down near the end, and before we know it, things will be back to normal. So, some housekeeping stuff. Remember, when we were in class before the COVID-19 break, we knew that on in May the 11th, we are going to have that meeting. It was going to start later in the afternoon. You guys were going to do some paperwork, and it was going to be a meeting for anyone who, at the end of this semester, was wanting to progress on to clinicals. Okay, now that still could have been 18 of you, that still could be 19. We've got one or two people from some previous classes that want to be thrown back in the mix. They'll be held to the same standard as everyone else. And they may or may not get thrown back into the mix. But so everybody goes to that meeting, because what I have to do is, a lot of people have classes they're taking this summer. And if you haven't registered, registration is open. If you need help with that, reach out to me. Okay. They're taking classes in the summer. Some people are retaking things to try to get a better grade. So what I do is, we have that meeting in May. Everybody fills out the paperwork. Everybody's good to go. Okay. Because I'm not going to be able to make that decision on the 15 that are going to clinicals until the last class is done in the summer and those grades are posted. Then I get everybody's grades together, and just on your qualifying course, I calculate everyone's GPA, and the top 15 with the highest GPA are the ones that go to clinicals. You'll get an email on that, okay? And we'll talk about this more later. Right now, what everybody needs to do is focus on the here and now. A lot of you are taking more than just your intro to phlebotomy and phlebotomy lab, and you need to focus in on those classes, okay? And this class as well. So now, some other housekeeping things. If you have any questions about your hepatitis, titers, blah, any of that kind of stuff dealing with that class that Ms. Spearman put you in, please make sure you reach out to her, okay? Make sure you're staying on top of that. If you're lost, if you're behind, if you have questions, email Ms. Spearman immediately and get on top of that, okay? Because we want this to be a smooth transition to the fall clinicals. Also, I have videos up for the last bit of material, including this one, but this will be the last bit of material as far as lecture. But I have all the lab videos, the last of the lab videos that would be up. Now, having said that, and I say this in these lab videos, but I'm going to say it again just in case somebody misses it. If you'll notice on your tentative course calendar that we have listed lab quiz number 6 that would have been on chapters 11, 12, and 13. We will not be having that quiz, okay? I put up late last night the last of your lab quizzes, which is lab quiz number 5, okay? And that particular lab quiz is on chapters 9 and 10. And remember, and everyone should know this by now, okay? But your lab quizzes are based off the chapters that are in your white laboratory binder. And for each one of those chapters, and for lab quiz number 5, that's chapters 9 and 10, there are study guides right behind those chapters. And those chapters are not long, guys. They're a couple of pages long. You read those chapters, you watch the corresponding videos that I put up a couple of weeks ago dealing with lab quiz number 5, fill out your study guides, study those study guides, and then take the quiz. And those quizzes are usually only about 33 questions long. So again, your very last lab quiz, that just regular quizzes that you're responsible for in lab, is now up, and it's for chapters 9 and 10 in your white lab binder. The videos that go with those have been up. You should have watched them already and read those, because what I want you to do is take lab quiz number 5 when you can, when you feel like you're ready, before it closes. Get that off your plate, because also late last night I put up the lecture test on chapters 13, 14, 15, and listings. Okay, those videos have been up for a while. Okay, So, and you should have already read those chapters in your textbook, watched the videos, filled out your study guides, and you've been studying, so that now go ahead when you feel like you're ready and before that lecture closes, take that test so that we now can put those just regular lecture and lab quizzes behind us, right? Because now all we have to do is study these videos that I'm putting up right now would have been for lecture test number 6 that you will not have. But some of this material that will be covered on these couple of videos, there may be a few of those questions on your final. But remember, read the chapters, watch the videos, fill out your study guides, and start studying the study guide that you have for your lecture final, okay? Because once you put 5 behind you in both lab and lecture, you can move on to just making sure you cover the material that would have been on 6, okay? You want to still cover it because there could be a few questions on your final dealing with these chapters, but you won't have a big test, neither in lab or lecture, on these, okay? So, but I'm going to go over this material. I'd like y'all to watch these videos, read these chapters, fill out the study guides, get your final study guide out, start studying that. Because you won't have any more tests now. Once you take lab quiz number 5 and once you take lecture test number 5, you will have no more tests in either one of lab or lecture until you take your final, okay? Now, and I said this in the other video, I'm checking today to find out if that if the lecture test day is still correct for lecture, and it's on your tentative course calendar. If that is correct, I'm going to send out an email and let you guys know. And then I will set a date today for your lab final. If you guys have any comments, questions, or concerns about any of this, please reach out to me and let me know, okay? We'll get through this, I promise. Okay, and then I'm also going to be putting out some dates for anybody who has not turned in the rest of their case studies. I'll be giving you some due dates to make sure that you get those in, and I'm grading those and have all those grades up. So that's where we are, okay? That leads us up to this. These videos that I'm going to be recording right now are the material that would have been covered on your very last regular test, which would have been test 6 on chapters 1, part 2, okay? Chapters 2, 3, and bioterrorism. They're very short chapters, but there could be some stuff on your final, so make sure you go over these. Okay, so let's get started, guys, because honestly, these chapters are important, okay? Because not only when we're out there in the workforce, especially in healthcare, not only should we be good at our job, we should know how to take care of our patients. We should know how to correctly ID our patients. We should know how to draw our patients' blood properly, which tubes to collect, where they go to. All those technical skills that you need to know to be able to draw blood properly so you don't harm your patient, so that you get the correct amount of blood, you get the correct blood, you know which tubes, additives. All those things are vitally important as a phlebotomist, okay? But another aspect we need to understand is communication, okay? And if you'll look right here, and you have the pleasure of being able to pause these and look at them. After you read these chapters in your textbook, after you go through these videos, fill out your study guides, and you study them, these are the things that you should be able to know, do, and comprehend, okay? So these are our learning objectives. These are the things that we want you guys to know once you have finished with these chapters. So when we talk about communication strategies for healthcare workers, I'm talking about more than just your patient, okay? That's very important, okay? And we're going to get to that, and I know you guys already know, but it's very important. Things get lost in communication sometimes. And now that we use a lot of technology, old school technology, from faxes all the way down to telephone, all the way down to text messaging. And you know as well as I do, I'm sure you guys have had these conversations before. We can send a text message to a friend, a relative, a significant other, and because they can't see the look on our face, because they can't hear the tone of our voice, they don't know if we're joking or if we're serious, right? And so sometimes it can cause misunderstandings, can even cause arguments, right? It can cause things to be lost. And so we want to make sure when we're in that hospital and we're dealing with giving very sensitive, very important information to our patients, we want to make sure they understand, okay? It's like when you're talking to your children and you want them to go and do something, okay? If you don't make sure that not only that you tell them, okay, in a way that they will understand, is this something you want done right now? Is this something that can wait till later? Okay, not only that, but you need to look at them and make sure the message you're sending them, they're actually receiving it. I'm sure there's been plenty of times that you've been talking to someone, whether it's a coworker, a friend, a relative, and you're telling them about something, and you can tell by the look on their face, they're not following you. They don't understand. Now, a good communicator is going to stop, reword their sentences, ask questions so they can get feedback, so they can understand what part of your story or your information have they understood and what part have they not understood. Okay, that's why we consider communication a loop. And you'll see on page 42 of your textbook, down at the bottom, there's a really good illustration that shows, and it shows that as a healthcare worker, you're sending a message. So you think of it like this. You're going to encode that message, kind of like a computer, right? So you're going to encode that message. And the way you encode it is you have verbal and nonverbal ways that you're kind of packaging this message up to send it out, right? And the way you encode it, the way you package that message is going to depend on, are you scared? You know, if you're scared that this is something vitally important, there's a fire in the house, there's a fire, then you may have a different encoding of that message than if you're just telling someone that someone's here to see them. Okay, so I want to make sure that makes sense to you guys, that you, as a healthcare worker, when you're in that healthcare setting, and this is true in any setting you're in, but we're focusing in on your patients and your coworkers, right? You have that message that you package up and you send it to another person, okay? And the way you package is important. You know, because if I'm trying to tell you something like there's something that could harm you or this is an emergency, you want that to be seen differently than if this is just an everyday message. So you send that message out with your verbal and nonverbal cues, and then your patient or your coworker receives that message. And then they try to unpackage it so that they can fully understand what you're trying to tell them. And when they're unpackaging it, they're going to look at your facial expressions, your body movements, your body language, how the tone of your voice, the pace that you're giving it, the volume, and they're going to use all those signals to try to understand the message that you're sending. Okay? And if you'll notice in that little really nice picture down there at the bottom of the page, it has all these things in the center that affect the way you package up the message and send it to them, and the way they receive the message. Your age and gender play a part in things. Your culture, your language. There's jargon out there. Sometimes if an older person is listening to a younger person talk, sometimes we don't understand what they're saying because this is some new jargon that's come out, some new catchphrase, some new wording that they're using that we really just are, for lack of a better word, we're clueless to. And that's something, that jargon and slang that we use every day with our friends and stuff, that's something we want to really avoid when we're out there in the workforce dealing with patients, dealing with coworkers, because you don't want your message to fall on deaf ears. You want the message that you're sending to not only be received, but understood. And if you use a lot of slang and jargon that they don't understand, they're not going to fully understand your message, okay? And then we have outside noise, that noise around us that interferes with us being able to hear and understand what we're hearing. And then sensory impairments, whether that's someone that's partially deaf, hard of hearing, They have lost some of their eyesight, or they're totally blind. These are things that play into it. And then you have feedback. You have verbal and nonverbal feedback. So as you give this message to the receiver, you want to look at that receiver and tell by their facial expression, body language, if they understand or not. Also, their feedback. Hey, I don't, what is a potassium? What is this? What is that? You want that feedback from them, both verbal and nonverbal, so that you can decipher, as are they hearing me or not. Okay? So, and then that's why we see this whole thing as a loop. So the verbal messages, they got to leave you first, right? Encoded in your message. And then that's through your voice, your tone, your facial expression, all that stuff, okay? So you want to make sure you're careful with that. And you also need that feedback, because without feedback, you as the sender has no way of knowing whether the message was accurately received, or if the message was somehow blocked or changed. Maybe they didn't change it on purpose, but they saw it differently due to a cultural difference, a language difference. Maybe they didn't hear you quite properly, right? So you want to make sure then you can go back and be able to further explain it, because this communication should be looping around until both the sender and the receiver both understand and both know that each of them understand, okay? And there's also a list on there of those things that I talked to you about things that can interfere with communication. You know, we talked about it, that like jargon, language differences, right? We talked about all those things. And you need to be careful. I have a tendency to talk fast, and I've said that to you guys before in class, and I've said if I'm talking too fast, if I'm going too fast, slow me down, right? So, but we have to take into consideration our pace, right? The tone of our voice. You know, I tell you guys all the time, sometimes when I come to work, maybe I've had a bad day. Maybe traffic was terrible that morning on my way to work. Maybe my dog threw up in the floor before I tried to get out and made me run late. I may have some anxiety and some stress. I may not be feeling that well. But right as I go to walk in the classroom, and this would pertain to you guys, as right as you go to walk into that patient's room, right as you get ready to talk to your coworker, you want to take a deep breath, okay, before you talk to them, and make sure that your tone is reflective of what you're saying, and not some other anxiety or feelings that you have about something that happened, because it'll interfere. It can make someone think you're mad at them or you're being rude to them, when really you're not. It has nothing to do with that. You just had a lot of things going on right before you walked into the room. That's why a lot of times you want to check your emotions, check your feelings, know where you're at, take a deep breath, center yourself, and say, okay, now I need to focus on this patient and communicating this information to them or my coworker, right? So, and then there's another really good figure 2-2 at the bottom of page 43 that shows the degree of communication, okay, from lowest to highest. And when they talk about that, they talk about the most effective ways to talk to somebody, right? And we're going to go over these because I think they're important, especially in this healthcare setting. But you guys can pause this and read over it as well. Plus, make sure you're following me and read your chapters, okay? But make sure the big things I want you to get from this slide is that communication loop I talked about, right? From the sender to the receiver and back to the sender. All of those are important in that loop, because not only do you need to make sure that you communicated your message correctly to your receiver, but you also need that feedback from your receiver so that you will know that the message was accurately received, okay? And we need to be really tuned in to people's cultural, behavioral, language differences, and any other issues that may cause them to not receive that message in the way you intended. So pause this, make sure you look at that communication loop, make sure you look at that feedback and the importance. Again, this slide talks about the language and age and language other than English and all these things. Now, first of all, we all understand that language, if there's lots of people here that speak another language, right? That English is not their first language, and I really respect that. I have always wanted to speak another language. I can write a little French, I can write a little Spanish from high school, excuse me, but never learned another language. And I think that's really, I hate that for most, because if you come across most Americans, not all, of course. There's a lot of them out there that are bilingual, or some can speak multiple languages. But for a big percentage of us, we don't speak another language. And I think that as someone in healthcare, if you're going to be in healthcare, trying to learn another language like Spanish, which is a really big and growing percentage of our population, or Spanish speaking, would be really helpful. It would not only make you more employable, but it would really help you. So if you ever thought about that, that'd be a really good thing for you guys to try to do. Also, we have a Deaf Action Center here in Shreveport that does a lot of really good work, and they have sign languages classes to teach you sign language. That's another thing that I have on my bucket list of things I want to get done. I would love for myself to be able to learn Spanish so that I can better communicate with a large portion of the population. And I would like to learn sign language better, because I think that's just a good tool in your toolbox as a healthcare worker to be more helpful to your patients and patients' families. And also, guys, it gives you a leg up on being more employable. It's one more thing you can put on your resume that makes you stand out of those other candidates. So again, we talked about this, right? And we talked about talking with children, okay? And I'm going to get into that a little bit more, but I also want to touch on translation services. Make sure that you know what your state laws are before you start allowing young people to translate for their relatives. Now, and a lot of times it works, at least temporarily, until you can get a translator in there. And most hospitals have a list of translators that they can use. Their services that if you're at a clinic or a small doctor's office or rural health clinic, there are services out there that can help you. There's Google Translator. These are things that can allow you to help better communicate with your patients and your patients' families. But make sure you understand what the laws are in your state, and your supervisor would know those things, but make sure you're aware of them. And then take real care communicating with children, right? We want to get down, we've talked about this before, kind of get down eye level, because one of the important things with verbal communication is to make sure you make eye contact with somebody. And then, of course, especially with children, but with everybody, be careful of the medical terminology. Some people absolutely understand what you're talking about, but that's why we need that communication loop, is you want to make sure that they're understanding the terminology that they're using, and they feed back to you. That's why a lot of times you'll hear people say, hey, do you mind repeating back to me what I said? I just really want to make sure that I'm communicating to you well enough and that you understand, okay? And we always want to be very respectful when we're talking to people. We don't want to talk down to them. We don't want to make them feel like it's their fault, because in communication, it's up to both people, okay? And it's really the healthcare worker's responsibility to make sure that our patients understand the information that we're giving them, right? So make sure that the vocabulary is different, of course, for a teenager all the way down to an elderly person. And we always need to take that into consideration. There's a lot of great information in your textbook on this too. And we're gonna touch on some of this, okay? So this gets to that, we're talking about that pace, tone, volume of your voice. And I talked about like the emergency situations. When you're trying to relay to someone that this is a stat situation, you're going to speed up talking. Your tone is going to go up a little bit. Your volume may go up just a little bit, okay? Because you want to make sure that you're relaying to this person that this is a stat situation. Also, we like to avoid the nicknames and referring to patients as the broken leg down the hall, okay? We really, I think we get complacent sometimes as healthcare workers, and we forget where we are, and we're under a lot of stress, and we're standing out in the hallway. We talk when we shouldn't. So always be very, very mindful of where you are. Be very mindful of what you're talking about, what you're saying. And guys, be respectful. Try to always have that empathy. Try to always put yourself in the position of that patient or that patient's family. What if that was your grandmother? What if that was your nephew? What if that was your child? Okay? So, and always make sure, it's like I told you, of that taking a deep breath before you walk into the patient's room. Taking that second to make sure you have yourself in the right frame of mind before you talk to your coworker, or it's just going to have the communication off kilter and possibly cause that very important information to not get to who it needed to go to. Okay? And remember, I always talk about customer service. We're in customer service business, right? It's like I told y'all in class, if no more students register for class and don't come to class, I don't have a job. There's lots of hospitals and clinics and doctors out there. You want to make sure they choose your facility. You want to be a part of that healthcare team that makes people want to come to whatever facility you're working at, because that's job security. That keeps you employed. Okay? So you always want to have that really pleasant facial expression. You know, they say a smile. Take a deep breath and smile, right? Your appearance, you want to appear very professional, right? If you're laying in a hospital room, or if your mother's laying in a hospital bed and she's sick and you're sitting there next to her and you're frightened for her and you're scared and you want her to get the best care she can get so she can get well and go home, the last thing you want is somebody coming in that room that reeks of cigarette smoke, that doesn't look professional, that their clothes are raw, wrinkled, and they're in a bad mood, and they're being short with you, they're being short with your mother, and y'all have done nothing to them. So try to remember that, and you don't want to be that person, okay? And always remember, the studies are out there that the first 30 seconds of that meeting a lot of times determines how patients perceive the quality of care offered by the phlebotomist. And then they see that as the lab, and then they see that as the whole hospital, right? So you are the face of the lab. So when you're out there, they don't see the clinical laboratory scientists that are sitting back there in that lab behind the machines and instruments a lot of times. They see you. You are the face of the lab. So guys, pause these. Make sure you're reading through them, because the pace that you're using, make sure you understand what that word means. It refers to that speed, right? Talking in a very nice, calm tone doesn't make anybody think that this is an emergency situation. But if you walk up to a coworker and a patient has fallen out of the bed, your pace needs to be different when you're talking to that nurse or that other healthcare worker, so that they will understand that this is a stat situation and y'all need to get into that patient's room immediately and take care of them, versus just explaining to a patient what you're about to do. You're about to draw some blood for some lab tests at their doctor's order, right? Okay? And when we're going into a hospital room where a patient is sick and they don't feel good and they're frightened and they're scared, they don't like needles, they're tired of being stuck, you want to really have that very soothing, calming way about you. You want to provide the best. You are part of this healthcare team, okay? And if you're going in there to draw their blood, you really want to take this seriously and be the best professional you can. Go in there, make these people feel better, okay? And again, I talked about that, taking a deep breath, making sure you're in the right state of mind, putting a smile on your face, and whatever you do, avoid sarcasm. This is not the place for it, okay? So when we talk about verbal communication, these are some of the things that I talked about having to do with dealing with people who have their eyesight, or they may not be blind, but their eyesight is impaired. They can't see as well. And also talking about people who possibly can't hear as well. And these are some things that I want you to read through and that you know, for all the way from speaking directly to the blind person themselves, not their companion. Don't ignore them. They may not can see well or see at all, but they can hear. Okay? And I'm sure you guys have heard this before. You don't want to move stuff around in their room. The way they have learned to adapt very well in their world is to make sure that they fill out their room. They know where everything's at. They know how many steps there are from the bed to the bathroom and things like that. And if you move things around and don't put it back, you could cause them to injure themselves, okay? So make sure you pause this and read over it. And it's like I told you, there's a lot of really good information in your textbook on all these things, including dealing with people with sensory impairments, which is on the page, the bottom of page 48. It also goes into talking about Braille and all the kind of technological advances out there that have given people, including blind people, the freedom to complete tasks that they have to do in their lives and live with increasing independence. So, you know, they're out there making it happen every day. And what we want to do is make sure we treat them with respect. We want to make sure that as we're communicating to them, we understand that they can't see the nonverbal, right? And so we want to take that into consideration. We want to make sure we're completing that entire communication loop. And you want to make sure that you do not move stuff around in their room and then not move it back, okay? Let's always show everybody respect. Okay, so now we're going to move into the nonverbal communication. And before we do that, before we move into the nonverbal communication, I talked to you guys about a really good figure they had in your textbook at the bottom of page 43. It talked about communication, ways you can communicate with a person. And it went all the way, and it calls lowest to highest, because what we're talking about is there's lots of ways you can communicate with a person out there, right? But what are the most effective ways to communicate so that you're sure that the information you're giving them, they fully understand, and it's the best way to communicate things to people? Okay, we have charts, right, that you can have. You can hand out charts or test results or whatever to a patient that's a bunch of numerical data on a sheet, and they may see it, and they may even, it's not that they don't understand it, but they don't know how to put it into context. They're just looking at those numbers. Nobody's explaining to them anything about the numbers. So sometimes they don't know how to take those numbers and put them in the real world action and know how they affect them, how they affect others. So it is a way to communicate with people and to get information out there, but it's not the best way to communicate that. A lot of times if you have that data, you would also give the person the data, and then you would verbally and non-verbally explain this data to them so they would understand how it affects them. Next on there is written documentation. You know, we don't use email. We don't use fax as much as we used to, but there are some people out there that still use fax. There's emails, and then there's handing out procedures on a piece of paper to your patient to send home with them. Guys, I'm going to tell you right now, I see it every day in healthcare, even personally myself. When a person is being discharged from surgery, they're not coherent because they've had some medication, or they've even sometimes been put under, and they've waited until they're out, but they're not even driving themselves. Someone is there to drive them home. Someone's there with them. So they're not spot on, right, to understanding exactly what's said to them. And then they usually go home, take some more medicine, go to bed. They wake up the next morning and they don't remember what you told them. And the information you give them on paper telling them what to do, a lot of that paperwork, they can read it, and it's not that, and we're talking about intelligent people, you know, educated, intelligent people reading this paperwork, and they're still, because there's a lot of medical jargon on there, it's very ambiguous sometimes. It doesn't go into great detail because it's one pager, right? They want to hand out this one piece of paper that helps this patient understand what they're supposed to do with their wound, what they're supposed to do with their medication when they get home. But because they weren't in the right state of mind to get that verbal, face-to-face communication, they don't always understand it. So they may have to call back into your office to get more understanding. You guys show customer service and respect for those people. They wouldn't be calling you if they understood. And I've seen people in doctor's office be rude to patients and say, well, it's on that piece of paper. Well, obviously it's on that piece of paper, but obviously it's a one-pager with bulleted out things that can lose some of that feedback. Okay, they're obviously giving you feedback, right? They're giving you feedback that they have that paper, they've read it, and they don't get it. okay? And you need to treat them with respect and be understanding and patient with them and take the time to try to verbally get them on the same thing. And that moves us to another one. It's a little bit, higher in that phone conversation. You'll see it down there. Sometimes you can use the phone conversation along with the written information they have at home to fill the gaps and make sure you get that feedback from them that they understand. And you need to treat them with respect, show them empathy. And guys, this is customer service. You want them to call into your doctor's office, and if you're having to explain this to them, get that piece of paper out and put it in front of you. Follow along with it and say, well, Miss Johnson, this is what he wants you to do. And then get her to say, well, tell me, do you understand that? Yes, ma'am. And then she repeats it to you. And now that loop has went through, right? That communication loop has went through. And now you know that she understands the information you've given her. I talk about this all the time when we're doing our introduction and our identification and our medical interview. You want to ask them about fasting, but sometimes you need to look them in the face when you're talking to them, because sometimes you'll say the word fasting and you can tell by the look on their face they don't understand what you're saying. That's when you might want to provide additional information where you'll say, did you eat anything? Did your doctor tell you not to eat anything after about 10 o'clock last night? Oh, yes. He told me that. I haven't eaten anything. And you haven't drinking anything, right? No, he told me not to do any of that. I didn't do it. Okay. Right? So sometimes they will very well understand the fasting when you say it. That's a medical term, right? And you can tell by the look on their face, they fully understand. You need to get that feedback from them so you will know as the sender of that message that they understand what you're talking about, okay? So, and then we have personal, when we're talking about written documents and you're just talking about procedures that on a piece of paper or they faxed over order for something, or they send an email of an order for something. A lot of times that's bulleted out information that's do this, do that, do this, or I need this, or I need that. Personal letters and memos and things like that are a little better at communication, because a lot of times they'll go into a little more detail, right, about what they're talking about. And then again, it's like I told you, you can combine some type of written information with a phone conversation. And if you make sure you're getting that feedback and closing that loop up, then you will know that that message is being received. But the highest one, if you'll see on there, is face-to-face conversations. And this is why. Right here on this slide is why. Because 80 to 90% is nonverbal. So if you'll see this, communication consists, as the slide shows you, 10 to 20% verbal. That's what you're saying. And 80 to 90% is nonverbal. So you can imagine that if they're looking at a piece of paper, or they're just hearing your voice over a phone, or they're reading an email, they're only getting 10 to 20% of that effective communication. They're missing a huge part of it by not seeing your face, not seeing your body language, and all that. And we need to understand that those nonverbal cues, okay, they can either be positive or negative, okay? You've probably had a conversation with a coworker before, a friend, a relative, and they have that look on their face like they're angry, and their hands are crossed across their front like they're mad, and they're just standing there. Right off the bat, you know it's harder to communicate with them. You're going to have to slow things down, okay? You're either going to be a part of the problem or part of the solution. Guys, this is plain and simple how it is. I see it as a obstacle, right? If I come up to a coworker, I've done nothing to them, and I'm trying to explain to them something that is important. It's important. I'm in healthcare. I'm trying to explain to them some lab results on a patient. I've just walked out of a patient's room, and they're obviously not feeling well. Something's wrong, and I'm trying to, and that's why communication is so important in the hospital. You're not telling your kids to pick their shoes up out of the floor. You're explaining to a patient a very difficult procedure. They need to know things that deal with their health care. You're explaining to another healthcare worker something that's vitally important and possibly could be life or death. Okay? So I see it as a challenge. So if I walk up to another coworker and they're obviously in a bad mood, they've got their arms crossed or whatever, I see it as a challenge myself to keep myself calm, to continue to talk in a calm and soothing voice so that I can disarm them. And as I see them start to loosen up, their arms start dropping down, they're starting to make eye contact with me, then I know I'm getting that across to them. I'm getting them to understand, and I've done what I need to do to make sure that gets there. Okay. Now, one of the things you'll see on this side down at the bottom we're going to talk about is that zone of comfort, right? Okay, what's a zone of comfort? All right, sometimes I talk about actually it being a hula hoop. Okay, I talk about it in the sense of a hula hoop, in the sense that I always say, you're standing there and you're having a conversation with somebody, and you really should have, if you talk about a hula hoop around your waist, right? That's my zone. Don't come into my hula hoop. When you walk up to me, especially if I've never met you before and I don't know you, when you come up to talk to me, you want to visualize that there's that space, like a hula hoop, between me and you should not invade that space, okay? Because, like we said earlier, that first 30 seconds of meeting somebody, what you're trying to do is make that patient feel more comfortable so that they will be more open to what you're doing. They'll be more understanding. They'll hear you better. They'll receive the information you're giving them, right? They'll grow to trust you, okay? So there is, on page 55 of your textbook, there's a little exercise, and I want you guys to do this, okay? Practice this with somebody at home. Have them come up to you and get too close to you, okay? If you've ever noticed this, when you first meet somebody, if they come up to you and they get in what you call your personal space or your zone of comfort, it makes you uncomfortable right at first. Now, after you get to know people, it's not so bad. So make sure you keep that in mind when you are going into a patient's room. They don't know you. They've never met you before. Not just a patient, but the family members that are in there, right? Make sure you respect that zone of comfort, okay? When you first walk up to the bed, don't go straight up to them and grab their arm and start doing that. Give them that zone of comfort. Give them that few minutes to communicate with them. Introduce yourself. Let them know what you're there for. Let them know what you're going to do before you invade their space, right? It's just all about respect. Also, make sure you understand cultural sensitivities, right? It's important that you become more and more sensitive to other people's cultural practices, okay? Now, guys, I'm going to be honest with you. People love to say this all the time. We live in America. It's the home of the brave and the free, right? We all know that lots of people fought in wars, to give us our freedom and things like that. Well, it's not just your freedom, okay? And especially in healthcare, because we have to be non-biased. When we go in there, we need to check that stuff at the door. We need to treat every one of our patients, no matter what church they go to, no matter what color their skin is, no matter what gender they are, if they're transgender, if they're gay, if they're straight, no matter what it is, we need to treat them with respect. That goes with the job. Okay, you have to leave those kinds of biases at the hospital front door when you come in. Okay, so make sure you understand that language differences. Make sure if you see that this person doesn't speak fluent English, it's not their first language, slow your pace down. Talk very softly and slowly. Okay, make sure you're paying attention. That's when we talk about it being aloof. Pay attention to their nonverbal cues. Okay. Make sure that you're understanding that. Okay, and we talk about things that distract us, right? It distracts us when we're trying to talk to somebody, and it distracts them when they're trying to listen to us. Okay, that's why there's a lot of helpful things in your textbook. It calls it environmental noise, and it's things in your environment that cause some different kinds of noises that can distract you. And some tips they talk about is if you walk into a patient's room and they have a visitor in there and they're talking to the visitor, first of all, you want to show them respect. You tap on the door, they ask you to come in. If they're talking, You show them respect by not invading their space immediately, right? Give them a second to stop their conversation. Be very polite, smile, introduce yourself, tell them what you're there for. And then if the two people in the room are talking to each other and the patient's looking at you, but it's hard for you to hear, you may want to just say, excuse me, please. It's important for me to explain this procedure to Miss Smith or Mr. Smith or your mother or your father, if you happen to know that information. Would you mind if we have just a quiet moment together for just a few minutes so that I can explain this to Miss Smith, because I don't want her to misunderstand. Thanks so much for your cooperation. You always want to be very polite. You always want to be very nice, and you want to make sure you fully explain to them why you need quiet. Okay? You might have a television on. There might be something in the room that's going on when you come in there. Okay? So you knock on the door, right? They tell you to come in. You come in. Mr. Smith is laying in the bed. He's watching a television show. You can say, excuse me, Mr. Smith. I'm Melissa. I'm from the lab, and I'm here to draw your blood. Your doctor's ordered some lab tests for you. And if he says, okay, say, well, Mr. Smith, I have something I need to tell you. Do you mind if I turn the TV down just a little bit? Because I want to make sure that you fully understand what I'm doing, because, I don't want to do anything to you without you understanding. Sure, honey. Right? And you turn the TV down a little bit. You explain to Mr. Smith exactly what you're doing. If you have any directions to give him before you do what you're going to do. And then once you're finishing up and you get ready to leave, you say to him, Mr. Smith, would you like me to turn the TV back up? No, that's okay. I've got it. Okay, great. Thank you, Mr. Smith, and you have a great day, right? Also, look at negative body language and distracting behaviors. If I'm talking to you and I'm kind of looking off, I'm not really looking at you when I'm talking, you're going to think that I'm not really interested in talking to you. And that's the same with the reverse. If I'm talking to you and you're not looking at me, I'm going to think you're not listening to me, right? Tapping of your foot, tapping on things, tapping a pencil, right? Those deep sighs, like you're aggravated at what you're having to do, either what you're hearing or what you're having to tell them. Those crossed arms, wrinkled foreheads. If you keep glancing at your watch, you know what you're doing when you're glancing at your watch? You're telling these people that you're in a hurry, and that what you're doing with them, you got to get out of here, okay? Don't do that. Never go into a patient's room or talk to another coworker chewing gum. Try not to do all yawn if you can. Sometimes I know it happens, but that's why I say get in that right state of mind before you go in the room, okay? So you can pause this, look over it, make sure you read the chapter, because there's a lot of other great information. But the things you want to make sure you do is show empathy and respect to your patient. You want to provide reasons for what you're doing. Okay? And you don't use negative words, right? And then make sure you try to stay on topic and make sure they understand what you're telling them. Okay, so still, obviously we're still talking about communication. So active listening, right? Active listening is important, okay? So you want to pay your undivided attention to the speaker, okay? And that's a big deal. Communication is the person speaking and the person listening. Listening is a big part of conversation. You can't just be the talker all the time. You need to listen to what they have to say, allow them to ask questions. So again, it's through that loop, right? It's not a dictatorship. You're not just going to tell somebody what you want to do, assume they understand, you don't really care about their feedback, and you move on. That is a bad communicator. So please make sure that you communicate the information to them, and then you become an active listener and observer to make sure that they understand what you've told them, get feedback from them, and then that way you can make sure the message was sent. Okay, we talked about this, right? Written communication, okay? Because it's still used out there, right? But if you have to chart anything on a patient or leave any written communications about things that have went on with that patient, and we've talked about things that you might have to document on a requisition form, you always want to use correct the words and pronunciations and your grammar, okay? And it's, I'll be honest, I'm not the best speller in the world. That's why I make sure I double and triple check this stuff to make sure. You always want to use permanent ink because a lot of these things can turn out to be court documents, and you need to try to take your time and write in a way that everybody can understand it. Okay, now we're talking about the role of family, visitors, and significant others that may be in the room or dealing with that patient while they're there, right? But before we move to that, one thing I want to bring up to you guys is health literacy. And if you'll look in your textbook, and you can Google it, there's lots of information out there on it. Make sure that you understand what health literacy is. I know y'all heard of literacy programs before, and there's those programs where adult literacy, or where people who, it's not that they can't read, but they don't read to the level that they need to, not only being able to read the words they see on the page, but to be able to comprehend and understand those words and what those words mean. That's what literacy is. Well, health literacy is that patients need to be able to, if you give them information, they need to be able to read it and understand it, whether it's prescription bottles and what's written on there, information they're given to take home with them after. If you're giving them some information for how to collect a clean catch midstream urine, okay, we need to understand that nearly half of all adults in the United States struggle with health literacy. That is, they do not have adequate knowledge of health issues based on their written, spoken, or conceptual knowledge. Okay? They have trouble understanding physicians' instructions, reading medical directions, or making informed healthcare decisions. In addition, the meaning of words varies with context and the age of the speaker. So that's why it's important that we make sure that we're communicating properly with people, because the research is out there that a lot of these people just don't understand what their prescription bottle says. They don't understand the information they're getting from their insurance companies. They don't understand the information that's sent home with their physician. And we want to make sure we close that gap, and that as one of our healthcare workers, as a team, that we're taking that responsibility on ourselves to make sure that our patients, whether they're 2-year-old, 12-year-olds, or 80-year-olds, that we're giving them the right communication to make sure they fully understand the information we're giving them, because a lot of this information has to do with their health, about diagnosing, monitoring, and treating our patients, and we want to make sure they understand. Okay, so you guys go out there if you can, look up that stuff about health literacy, and make sure that you understand that. We also want to make sure we take that on ourselves, right? Also, on page 56 of your textbook, there's a really good figure and a very good information on that zone of comfort. Make sure you understand that. There's also developing compassion and professionalism with touching bedridden patients. There's some good information on that. We talk about cultural sensitivity. What is culture? Okay? We talk about cultural sensitivity, but what is it? Remember, when I talked about the home of the free and the brave, right? We're free here, so, right? We're free to understand that not everybody goes to the same kind of church that we do, or some people don't go to church at all. We have to understand that some people's traditions and practices, their customs and behaviors, are associated with a certain group. Some people don't celebrate Christmas, right? Some people have different foods that they eat, music that they listen to, healthcare practices that they have, right? Some people like to use other forms of healthcare, non-traditional healthcare, right? And then values, the accepted principles of their particular group, right? Their education, their financial security, okay? These are all things that we need to take into consideration, and make sure you understand that, okay? And when you're a healthcare worker and you're discussing a procedure with a patient and she is seated, then you may need to sit down so that you're eye level with that patient. Notice when you're sitting down to talk to the patient and their family, the spacing or the zone of comfort. Make sure you understand your body language, not just of the patient, but of the family members. Look at their face. You want everyone to understand, because you've got to remember, when that patient goes home, okay, and you've given this information of something they need to do while they're at home, the patient is scared. They may be on medication. They may not be clearly thinking. You want to make sure that those family members understand too, because then when they get home, mother or father may ask for their guidance. Hey, do you remember what that lady told us? Okay, so we want to make sure that we do all that, okay? So talking about family members and all that and people that may be in the room, we understand that we may come into that room and their daughters or sons or husbands or wives, maybe even their children, right? But we also have physicians. You may walk into that room and the physician's in there, a physician's assistant, nurses, radiology techs, respiratory techs may be in there. They may have priests or chaplains may be in there. And you got to understand, patients have the right to privacy, right? They have a right to talk to any of their other healthcare providers, any priests, chaplains, or any like that with privacy. So make sure you take that in consideration when you come in there. And unless that specimen is stat or time, you should give that patient the time with those people that they need and come back later, okay? And you must always maintain confidentiality of anything you hear in that patient's room. So we talked about this before, right? Introducing yourself. You need to introduce yourself, and we go over this all the time, and you guys can pause this and read through it, but we go in there and we tap on the door if it's closed, right? Even if it's not closed, you kind of stick your head around and say, hey, Miss Johnson, this is Melissa. I'm from the lab. I'm here to draw your blood, okay? Is it okay if I come in? Yes, ma'am. Then you come in. You do not barge into patients' rooms, okay? And then make sure you respect that zone of comfort. Make sure that you ID your patient properly, right? And always be honest with your patient and always thank them when you're done. We talk about that in there, right? What is it we say? And I hope you guys are practicing all this stuff at home, right? I need you to leave this on here for about 15 minutes, okay? After about 15 minutes, peek under there. If this has stopped bleeding, you feel free to go ahead and take this off, okay? Thank you and have a great day, right? This is all about customer service. Treat these people with the respect they need. It's just the right thing to do, but also it reflects on your profession. If you want people to respect phlebotomists as a profession, if you want people to give phlebotomists more responsibility so they can get better pay and better wages, then you have to lead the charge to set that example as a good phlebotomist. So we understand that we have computers and documents and all this stuff needs to be patient's confidentiality. We don't want people's records out there. You never want to take pictures. That's why you do not take pictures in your lab anywhere in that hospital, because we can zoom in on those pictures on those cell phones now, and we could see there could be somebody's chart with their information, their social security number, their name, their date of birth, their lab results back there, laying on that paper behind you. That's why you never want to do that. They have passwords for a reason, right? Okay, you want to make sure that you never share your password with your coworkers, or be careful of writing down your passwords and leaving them places so people can find them. Okay? You also want to be careful of privacy issues if you're faxing something over to somebody or making a copy of something. You don't want to leave somebody's private information on a copy machine face down on there and walk off, take the copy you made and leave it for other people to see. When you have people's paperwork in your hand, make sure that you're staying on top of what you're doing with that, okay? Okay, so we use a lot of barcodes out there, right? Because it reduces transcription errors, right? It speeds up sample processing, right? And those barcodes are light and dark bands that you see, and we see them on our requisition forms, right? And we talk about radio frequency identification. Make sure you understand what that is. That's a form of identification tag for identifying and tracking records, equipment, supplies, specimens, and we can now track patients and employees. And if you are over at Willis Knight, and I'm just going to use them for example, they have Mobi, which is a handheld device that has a barcode reader on there. It can read the back of your badge and know what employee it is. It can read the badge on the patient's armband, know what patient it is, right? So we're moving to this. You need to understand how these barcodes work. It's really good because it cuts down on handwriting errors, on people writing down the wrong name, misspelling names, right? or us not being able to understand somebody's handwriting. That's why it's important for you to take your time if you have to handwrite something down and write it down in a way that everybody can understand it. Okay, you may have in your facility a blood drawing list. You may or may not. Your facility may not work this way. But you do want to understand that what a blood drawing list is. They usually generate these things. If they're generating them each morning, it's useful for each floor or nursing unit to understand who's having blood drawn that day. When a healthcare worker finishes on a particular floor, he can document that it's completed. If you have that list, you go up, draw all the blood on that floor, then you can document that you finished the blood drawing on that floor. Talking about reporting laboratory results, okay? So both Joint Commission, and we remember Joint Commission is that accrediting agency that gives them the stamp of approval, right? Gives hospitals and home health stamps of approval saying that they're doing everything the correct way. And CAP, which is also that one that gives the seal of approvals to labs, right? They tell us that the lab results should be confirmed, dated, and accompanied by permanent reports that are available in the lab, as well as the patient's medical record or chart, okay? Report forms should include the quality control limits and delta checks, QC that allows for detection of clinically significant changes in lab results, okay? So most of this stuff is electronic. We have electronic medical records now. So most of these patients are not kept, in the lab in the sense that we don't have filing cabinets full of reports, right? They're in the lab. You have an electronic medical record, and that patient's electronic medical record has a tab in it, just like you would in the old school paper ones. And under that tab, their lab results, their x-ray results, their MRI results, right? But we also have to have computer generated that we can get to quickly reports that show that we have run quality control, that we've done delta checks, that our QC is in range, and that we have a way of, like with the Levi Jennings chart that can be in a lab, in a computer, can show that we can detect any kind of clinically significant changes that are occurring, right? Sometimes we have to give verbal reports, right? We have to call up with critical values, right? Or stats. Verbal reports are open, and we talked about this in class before. They're open for more error, right? Now, they're very useful if you have a critical value or stats, but verbal reports must always be followed up with written and electronic documentation. And you want to make sure you follow whatever policies and procedures are in place in your facility. Then, of course, a lot of this has moved to electronic medical records. Computerized reports, as we know, are more reliable than verbal, right? The report should be sent promptly to the facility to clinical decisions and for billing, right? And in hospitals, they're set up that way, okay? They're set up so that the software that hospital's using has an electronic medical record. Part of that electronic medical record, it sends it over to the billing department, okay? It sends it up to the floor, right? And so all this stuff is handled inside that software, and that software is set up to follow CAP rules, Joint Commission rules, right? But these things are there because the advantage is the elimination of paper, right? We're trying to protect the environment. We don't want paper everywhere. Paper can get lost, right? Access of consolidated data from multiple sites. So that doctor can go onto that patient's electronic medical result, and at the tip of his finger, he can get their history and physicals, all their lab results, MRI, x-rays, all right there in one place, right? It gives them the ability to import that information quickly, because down in the lab, we run those results, we put that tube on the machine spins it around, reads that barcode, it knows exactly what patient it goes to, it knows exactly what test has been ordered, it runs those tests, and then it knows that it goes to that patient, it immediately goes to that patient. You're, as the clinical laboratory scientist, you go over to your computer, it pops it up, you look at it, you compare it, you make sure it's all right, everything looks good, you sign off on it electronically, it immediately goes to that patient's electronic medical record and alerts the floor that it's been done. Remember, all this documentation is vitally important, okay? The quality of care, you want to make sure that if you really want to make sure that you're giving the best quality of care to your patient, that's why you want to do that medical interview. And I know that y'all have been out there before and you've seen phlebotomists, people not doing it this way. But guys, you can see from what I've been teaching you in lab and lecture that if you are not documenting things like the medicines that these patients may be on, the fact that they didn't fast or did fast, okay, the fact that they ran a marathon that weekend before they came in, all these things play a part in this patient getting the best quality of care, and you documenting that is important. Also, documenting things helps with coordination of care. We want to make sure these patients aren't being stuck more often than they need to. We want to make sure that if they ordered a potassium and an hour later they ordered an electrolyte panel, we might want to talk to our nurse, talk to our healthcare provider to provide that coordination of care to make sure we're not doing that wrong. Accreditations and licensing, it helps with that. Legal protection and research, because if it didn't get documented, it didn't happen. Plus, in research, if we're documenting all this stuff, then we can see trends and things that are going out there and help us when we're trying to make advancements in healthcare, from vaccinations to medicines to treatments that were working better to the increase of certain diseases out there. It's all vitally important. Documenting everything is really, really important in healthcare. And we need to know that our documentation needs to be accurate. It needs to be objective, right? Check your biases at the door. What you're doing is being very objective. You're just reporting what is there, right? You need it to be short, because we're in a hurry. Healthcare, we're trying to get things done. We want it short and to the point about what's going on, and it needs to be legible. I need to be able to understand it and read it, right? Errors should never be erased. We talked about this before. Mark through it with a single line, write ER or error and your initials, and then write out what it should have been. Electronic errors should be corrected by authorized individuals. Include all relevant information in a timely manner. We always time and date everything we do, right? So policies and procedures. You hear me say this all the time. All healthcare facilities, whether we're talking about Willis-Knighton or Ochsner's, or whether we're talking about a small doctor's office, all of them have policies and procedures manuals that guide practices, right? In those manuals, they have specimen collection manuals. So in the specimen collection manual, it's going to line out exactly how you collect finger stick, capillary blood, venous blood, urine samples, how that particular healthcare facility would like the specimen collection to go, how the patient is prepped, the type of collection and amount of blood they want done, the timing they want it done in, any type of special handling and transportation and labeling. All that's going to be in your specimen collection manual that is kept in your laboratory. They have administrative procedures. Everyone has a job description, okay? That's in there. Any disciplinary action that would take. How do we get from me getting in trouble for something to me being fired? There's a procedure for that, okay? And all those procedures need to be followed, and any reports need to be documented so that we follow it from A to Z correctly. What's the attendance policy there? What's the holidays, etc.? All these things are in the administrative procedures and policies of that manual. And then you're going to have the safety manual, which is going to talk about any chemicals that you may have in your lab or in your facility. Safety having to do with radiation, with fire, any disaster plan. You're going to have a disaster plan. You're going to do drills, right? And you're going to have an exposure control plan and any materials that need to go along with that exposure control plan. Okay? So infectious control procedures, okay? There's going to be procedures for that. Handling specimens, isolation, disposable, decontamination, and hand washing. All those things to prevent the spread of infection from patient to patient and coworker to coworker. You're going to have policies and procedures for how we do this, right? That's why I go through it step by step. That's why everything is laid out in your lab manager, your lab manual. From number 1, which is washing your hands and choosing your appropriate PPE, Each step that you use when you're drawing that patient's blood, from finding the vein, popping the tourniquet, cleaning with concentric circles, all the way down to your post-analytical phase that talks about proper disposal of your waste, right? That is how policies and procedure manuals are written out. Then you have a quality control procedure manual, how you monitor reagents and equipment. When I worked at the hospital, we had a log where each day it was somebody's job, and they took the log, was on a clipboard, and they went into the refrigerator. If you were in chemistry, there was somebody that did this job in chemistry. You went through all the reagent that was in the refrigerator. You checked off to make sure that it wasn't expired, the caps were on, you had enough in there, how many did you have, so that we could keep up with reordering, right? But also to make sure we don't miss anything that's expired or anything like that, and that everything's stored properly. We also had procedures for how to properly store everything, from our supplies to our blood samples. We had things in there talking about the stability of our reagents, how long they were good for. We also had procedures for, just like our urine dipsticks. When they come in and they're sealed up, they have an expiration date on them. But when you break that seal and start opening those strips up, you have to change that expiration date, because now that you've opened them up for the very first time and air has now been introduced in there, the expiration date changes, and that should be in your quality control procedure manual so that you and your other co-workers in the lab know what to do. There's precision and accuracy measuring in quality control. All that's going to be in your procedure manual. Also, in the lab that I worked in, every year annually, anyone that worked in that lab had to go through the policies and procedures manuals, make sure they knew where they were, went through them, read them, make sure they're comfortable with them, the ones that pertain to the particular job description in which they do. Because if you are a person working in the lab that you would never do any type of quality control, then that may not be in your job description. Then you may not have to read that part of the policy and procedures, but you were responsible for reading those. And then at the back of them, you would initial off saying that you read them. Now, a lot of you are going to be, this is going to happen to you when you go to work, and you're going to feel like you're just going to want to breeze through that and just sign your name, because you don't want to sit there and read that boring book from beginning to end. The problem with doing that, guys, the problem with doing that is if what you're telling everybody, you're telling administration at your hospital, you're telling your supervisor at your hospital, you're telling your co-workers, you're letting Joint Commission and CAP know that you were given that book, you were told to read it so that you would understand it, so you would know how to do your job properly. You initialed off that you did, but you didn't read it. Well, now you can't use the excuse, well, I didn't know. Okay? You can't use that excuse. So then when you're out there and you're doing your job incorrectly because you didn't take the time to read the policy and procedure manual, but you initialed off that you did, then when you get in trouble for that, you could easily be fired because you're saying you didn't know how to do it, that you weren't trained properly, but you initialed off that you read it. So that's why that could turn into a problem. So, and I understand that these procedure manuals are boring and they are lengthy, but there's a lot of downtime in hospitals. And when you have that downtime, instead of spending all of your downtime talking to your friends or playing on your phone, which you shouldn't be doing it all in there because you're going to get germs all over your phone and take it home with you or get it in your eye or whatever, because we touch our face all the time. What you should be doing is taking some of that time to sit down and familiarize yourself with those policy and procedure manuals to make sure you fully understand what should and should not be done in your lab. Okay, so next thing we want to look at, and you can pause this, is what they call floor books. And really, these are typically now mostly are going to be something that's kept inside the computer, because floor books were things that were director of laboratory departments, staff members, locations of the labs, contact numbers, operating hours, reference range, instructions, methods for collection, all these stuff, right? This was kept in what they called floor books. But mainly this information is now all inside the computer. Okay, but you do need to know what a floor book is. You could be questioned on this. This could show up on your registry exam. And you may go to a facility that has it in a more of a book setting like this, but typically it's usually in a computer setting now. Okay, talking about confidentiality and privacy, and this is a big deal, okay? You may overhear, as a healthcare worker, private and privileged conversations that go on between doctors and nurses or other doctors. That communication is privileged. Guys, there's no quicker way in the world to lose your job than to break confidentiality and privacy. Do not do it. You wouldn't want it done to you, and don't do it. I don't want to see you lose your job over it. There's even legal ramifications of this kind of stuff. Okay, so here's our summary, and y'all can read through this of the things that we went over, okay? And again, this you can follow through most of this in chapter 2 in your software. I mean, in your software, listen to me, in your textbook. And it goes into a lot of stuff about computer and documentation basics, because that's where we moved, right? We've moved to mostly semi-automated or automated systems. Almost everyone has computers. There's a lot of good information on security. The workplace, we're doing a lot more sitting behind computers. That's something you want to make sure you're sitting properly in your chair and all that. You want to get your back, your neck hurting, and a lot of that may be happening to you guys now while you're at home. But there's a lot of great information in there about the use of barcodes, about manual methods, semi-automatic and automatic methods. A lot of great pictures in your textbook. So I can't sit and read you your entire textbook, okay? So we just try to hit the high points. You have study guides that go with them, but make sure you're reading these chapters too, okay? Because there's some really interesting case studies in the back of your textbooks that you might want to look through. But remember, again, we will not have a specific test on these chapters that I'm putting up, okay? Chapter 1, Part 2, Chapter 2, 3, and bioterrorism, you're not going to have a lecture test number 6. But you do need to read these chapters and be familiar with it, not only for going forward, and it's useful to you as phlebotomy, but in Allied Health 211, when you take it, you're going to need it, and when you sit for your registry exam, you'll need this information. And there will be some questions on your final. So make sure you're watching these videos, reading these chapters, and filling out your study guides, and then move on to start studying your lecture study material that you have, okay? You guys have a great day. Look for the next video.